September 19, 1942. The altitude is 27,000 feet above Berlin. The gloved hand of Oberleutnant Wilhelm Jornun gripped the control stick of his Messerschmitt Bf 109G2 so hard his knuckles turned white. He stared through his gun sight and simply refused to believe his own eyes. How was this even possible? The British aircraft ahead was maintaining a speed that fundamentally should not exist at such an incredible altitude, especially not for a heavy bomber. Jornun was squeezing absolutely every drop of performance out of the Luftwaffe's newest pride. His engine was pumping out 1,475 horsepower, and the boost gauge needle was already vibrating on the red line. This relates to situations where even the most advanced military technology bows down to pure, unfiltered pragmatism. The engine temperature was treacherously creeping into the critical zone, threatening to turn into a complete mechanical failure. The gap between the machines only kept growing, leaving the German ace with nothing but the bitter task of radioing his wingman that the target was slipping away. Against the crystal-clear September sky, the Brit's silhouette looked like a pure mockery. This arrogant intruder had not a single gun turret, nor an ounce of visible defensive weaponry. It featured only a perfectly smooth wooden fuselage, painted in the azure blue of photo reconnaissance. Its two engines roared with a confidence that bordered on a blatant insult to the elite of German fighter aviation. At the controls sat Flight Lieutenant George Perry, and for his de Havilland Mosquito, this was merely the fourth sortie of its kind over enemy territory. Sensational details from the corridors of the Reich Aviation Ministry. In early 1941, German intelligence agents in neutral Sweden obtained blueprints of the newest British bomber, which is being developed in the strictest secrecy. What they saw on the classified papers caused the venerable experts of the Luftwaffe to burst into fits of Homeric laughter. Great Britain, once the mistress of the seas and skies, has sunk to the point of gluing military aircraft from birch plywood, Ecuadorian balsa, and Canadian spruce. Where has the renowned British metal gone, and is the proud empire so exhausted by the total blockade that it is forced to send its best pilots to the front in fragile pressed boxes made of ordinary sawdust? This relates to typical manifestations of blind overconfidence, where propaganda and wishful thinking are presented as harsh reality. The leading Reich aviation engineer Friedrich Lang placed an absolutely devastating and mocking report on the desks of his superiors in March 1941. The official document categorically stated that the British claim of a maximum speed exceeding 400 miles per hour for an absurd wooden structure is either a pathetic attempt at disinformation or a gesture of complete strategic despair. How can a twin-engine plywood trinket without a single gun turret, without steel armor and protective machine guns, compete with the advanced machines of German engineering genius? In the government offices of Berlin, this insane idea was taken as final and indisputable proof of the imminent collapse of the British military industry. While the giant factories of Germany continuously produce heavily armored Heinkels and Dorniers bristling with large caliber barrels, a bewildered London is switching to the mass production of flying furniture. Luftwaffe pilots have already contemptuously dubbed the amusing novelty the leaky bomber and the English wooden cabinet. London's official statement that this strange flying nightstand can outrun any modern fighter solely due to unimaginable speed sounds like a blatant joke in the beer halls of Munich. This relates to those striking historical paradoxes when arrogance and pride completely obscure the common sense of even the most experienced military analysts. No one in Hermann Göring's department even entertains the seditious thought that the rejection of heavy machine gun towers and steel plating is not a sign of total poverty, but a brilliant mathematical calculation. A cold-blooded calculation that the colossal weight saved on armament will allow the installation of the most powerful aviation engines and filling the tanks with fuel to the very brim. Only 2 crew members, locked in a cramped wooden capsule, must wager their lives daily, relying exclusively on the flawless laws of aerodynamics. But while they continue to laugh loudly at the captured blueprints in luxurious Berlin offices, British carpenters, piano makers, and ordinary furniture builders are quietly gluing fuselages in regular civilian factories. The front pages of Reich newspapers scream that the weak enemy has finally run out of precious aluminum, which means absolute victory in the air is just around the corner. No one wants to notice the uncomfortable truth that this forced minimalism does not require scarce metals and does not divert the strategic resources of the state at all. British tactical cunning is smugly presented to the press as the agony of a defeated enemy clutching in panic at any straw before the inevitable finale. Mocking newspaper articles and cartoons about ridiculous wooden aviation will be printed exactly until the first English cabinet appears in the optical sights of shocked German aces. The collapse of the Reich's boasted technologies broadcast live on radar stations. How could it happen that the elite of Jagdgeschwader 27 found themselves in the role of helpless extras? On a September morning over the North Sea and Berlin, a relentless physical thrashing of the pride of German aviation engineering unfolded, not just an aerial pursuit. Berlin radars detected a lone target at 0 hours 47 minutes, flying at flight level 27,000 feet. Dispatchers confidently launched 12 Gustav modification interceptors, absolutely certain of a swift reprisal against the brazen intruder. Wilhelm Jornen, a seasoned veteran with 23 victories behind him, visually acquired the Briton from a distance of 6 miles and began a classic approach, anticipating easy prey. The Luftwaffe fighter, pushed to its maximum continuous thrust, rapidly closed the distance to 3 miles, then to 2. At a distance of 1 mile, the German ace was already preparing to squeeze the trigger, anticipating how the wooden fuselage would splinter into pieces. But instead of a triumphant volley, the Berlin command received a resounding slap in the face. The Mosquito pilot, George Perry, simply advanced the throttle, and the British machine surged forward with an instantaneous response, leaving absolutely no chance to continue the attack. Jornen desperately pushed the control stick through the gate into emergency power, pushing the speedometer needle past the 400 miles per hour mark. The gap between the aircraft continued to grow inexorably, turning the chase into a public humiliation of Germany's entire fighter doctrine. This relates to those harsh laws of thermodynamics and aerodynamics that cannot be deceived by loud propaganda slogans or newspaper bravado. At an altitude of 27,000 feet, the air becomes critically thin, turning into a trap for unprepared engines. During 8 minutes of tense pursuit at the absolute limit, the German DB605A engine literally choked from oxygen starvation. The single-stage supercharger strained itself to the breaking point, trying to force even a little thin air into the cylinders, leading to a catastrophic drop in power output. Coolant and oil temperatures rapidly shot into the red zone, while the consumption of scarce fuel exceeded all conceivable tolerances. At the exact same time, the British Merlin 21 power plants felt completely at home in the freezing stratosphere, emitting a steady and mockingly calm hum. Rolls-Royce engineers equipped these motors with advanced two-stage superchargers, specifically designed to maintain stable manifold pressure at extreme altitudes. While the German machine choked on its own exhaust gases and lost horsepower with every 100 feet gained, the Briton delivered rated thrust without the slightest sign of overheating or strain. The wooden bomber maintained a perfect cruising speed, as if on a leisurely pleasure flight over its own airfield, leaving its heavy pursuers far behind in its wake. At 0 hours 3 minutes, the overheating Messerschmitt was forced to shamefully abort the pursuit simply to avoid melting in the sky due to overheated pistons. The British reconnaissance plane casually dissolved into the Berlin sky without receiving a single scratch and completing its mission with chilling composure. Returning to base, the dejected pilot faced the paperwork, drafting a report that would soon have the effect of an exploding bombshell in the highest echelons of power. The combat report was dry, devoid of emotion, and therefore even more unbearable for the Luftwaffe generals reading it in their warm offices. This relates to moments when dry statistics and rigid engineering protocols destroy entire military strategies more certainly than carpet bombings. The document stated in black and white, interception attempt at 27,000 feet failed, target maintained a speed exceeding the maximum continuous capabilities of the interceptor. Despite 8 minutes of running the engine to total exhaustion, closing to effective firing range proved physically impossible. The unarmed wooden twin-engine aircraft flew at a speed of 420 miles per hour or more, effortlessly escaping the elite unit. This document, slowly creeping up the bureaucratic ladder all the way to Berlin, made officers pale with shock at the simple truth. The Reich possesses no aircraft capable of catching the British piece of plywood. A resounding scandal in the luxurious halls of the Karen Hall residence, where the arrogance of the Luftwaffe High Command collided with harsh reality. The crisis that cowardly staff officers had tried to hush up for so long finally burst out during a December meeting led by Hermann Göring himself. The commander of an elite fighter unit, Oberstleutnant Herbert Eilefeld, choosing no soft words, dumped the monstrous truth on the commander-in-chief's table. The British plywood contraption operates over the sovereign territory of Germany with absolute mocking impunity, turning the boasted pilots of the Reich into helpless spectators. Over the past 2 months, the praised Falcons have made 43 desperate interception attempts, and absolutely every single one of them ended in public disgrace and 0 successful engagements. The enraged Reichsmarschall, whose generous promises about a clear German sky now looked like a pathetic caricature, demanded immediate answers from his best engineers. A special technical commission of the Aviation Ministry, led by certified engineer Friedrich Seiler, received a categorical order to unravel the secret of the British wooden miracle. The pedantic German minds expected to discover some secret technology, a breakthrough super engine, or an unknown aerodynamic trick. But what they saw in the available blueprints and reports turned out to be a much more bitter pill for the pride of Teutonic designers. It was not a technological leap, but a triumph of crystal-clear, ruthless British pragmatism that completely shattered customary templates. This relates to those historical turning points when an established paradigm suddenly collapses under the weight of one brilliantly simple solution. The wooden structure, which had been so loudly mocked in Berlin offices just a year ago, turned out to be an unsurpassed masterpiece of structural efficiency. Properly glued laminated wood made of birch plywood and balsa provided a strength-to-weight ratio not inferior to the best aviation aluminum. The absence of strategic metal in the construction meant that the production of these elusive machines did not deplete the reserves critically needed for the production of standard fighters. But the most shocking discovery for Sealer's commission was the incredible, almost outrageous weight savings achieved through the complete abandonment of protection. The traditional German design philosophy always relied on heavy armor, multi-layered protection, and terrifying defensive armament. The pride of the Reich, the Heinkel and Dornier bombers, dragged tons of steel plates, machine gun turrets, and a huge crew, turning into clumsy flying fortresses. Each turret added hundreds of pounds of weight, required an extra gunner, and created monstrous aerodynamic drag that inevitably killed speed. British designers simply took all this ballast and threw it overboard, making a phenomenal bet that absolute speed would provide much more reliable protection than large-caliber machine guns. The saved thousands of pounds of weight went into strengthening the structural integrity of the hull and installing additional fuel tanks for long-range raids. This relates to fundamental conceptual failures when the attempt to create a universal soldier leads to defeat by a highly specialized professional. Sealer, in his classified report, summarized with ruthless directness that the British had created a machine optimized exclusively for one purpose: to fly incredibly fast and remain unscathed. This Spartan design philosophy overnight made the entire traditional approach to heavy bombers hopelessly obsolete and inefficient. German fighters were developed for completely different tasks. Maneuverability, rate of climb, and firepower in close combat were prioritized. The famous Messerschmitt was excellent in vertical maneuvers, and the radial engine of the formidable Focke-Wulf irretrievably lost its efficiency at altitudes above 20,000 feet. Not a single advanced German machine was designed to spend hours in an exhausting pursuit of a swift target in the freezing stratosphere. The de Havilland designers with surgical precision felt out a massive blind spot in the Luftwaffe's capabilities and cynically exploited this breach. German perfectionism, striving to cram the maximum amount of functions, weapons, and armor into every aircraft, suffered a crushing fiasco. A simple wooden arrow, stripped of everything unnecessary, pierced the clumsy bureaucratic and engineering machine of the Reich, proving that minimalism in war often turns out to be a much more formidable weapon than tons of the best Krupp steel. January 30th, 1943, will forever enter the annals of military history as the day of the most grandiose and public disgrace of German aviation. The capital of the Reich was lavishly decorated with thousands of banners, preparing to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Nazis coming to power with pomp and grand scale. The main event of the festive morning was supposed to be a massive radio address by the Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring, broadcast to the entire country. Millions of citizens clung to their radio receivers, expecting to hear thunderous assurances about the absolute safety of German cities from enemy air raids. The pompous Reichsmarschall in a glittering dress uniform approached the microphone at exactly 11 o'clock in the morning, preparing to unleash torrents of customary bravado upon the listeners about an impenetrable aerial shield. At this exact same time, cutting through the crystal-clear frosty air at an altitude of 25,000 feet, 3 uninvited guests were inexorably approaching Berlin. These were the very same notorious Plywood Mosquitoes from the 105th Squadron of the Royal Air Force, which had already managed to become a true curse for German anti-aircraft defense. This time, there was not a single pound of explosives in their bomb bays, because the British command had prepared a much more sophisticated psychological weapon for the top leadership of the Reich. Only powerful photographic cameras were installed in the bellies of the smooth wooden machines, designed to capture the grandiose humiliation in the very heart of the enemy empire. The crews calculated the timing of their audacious visit with split-second precision to orchestrate the maximum propaganda effect right during the solemn speech. This relates to those masterful tactical moves when informational and psychological damage exponentially exceeds any physical destruction from carpet bombings. At exactly 3 minutes past 11 o'clock, just as Göring began to build his oratorical momentum and broadcast about the total dominance of his pilots, the mockingly steady hum of British engines resonated over the central squares of Berlin. The capital's anti-aircraft defense system plunged into a state of absolute, uncontrollable chaos when the radars detected the rapidly flying targets far too late. Air raid sirens began to wail, their piercing howl ruthlessly invading the live broadcast of the state radio station, mixing with the voice of the bewildered Reichsmarschall. Thousands of anti-aircraft guns opened panicked, completely erratic fire into the sky, but their heavy shells exploded helplessly thousands of feet below the unreachable wooden trio. The Berlin dispatchers, covered in a cold sweat from realizing the sheer scale of the catastrophe, desperately scrambled 16 interceptors, ordering them to eliminate the brazen intruders at any cost. The German fighters surged upward on full afterburner, burning precious fuel and trying to reach the British aircraft, which leisurely performed a lap of honor right over the government districts. But all the efforts of the interceptors shattered against the insurmountable barrier of altitude and speed, leaving the elite pilots of the Luftwaffe in the role of powerless extras in this grandiose aerial parade. The British pilots calmly took a series of high-quality photographs of the panicking capital, after which they smoothly banked onto their return course without even bothering to push the throttle to maximum. Thousands of ordinary Berliners who had taken to the streets watched this entire fantastic picture of the total impotence of the praised aviation with bated breath. This relates to moments of the ultimate collapse of propaganda myths, when a beautiful lie from the loudspeakers shatters into pieces against the cruel and irrefutable reality overhead. Meanwhile, a true drama was unfolding in the radio studio. Hermann Göring's voice, which just a minute ago sounded so authoritative and confident, began to treacherously tremble and break into hysterical wheezes. The Reichsmarschall stumbled over every word, agonizingly lost his place in the pre-written text, and could not hide the bubbling, scorching rage that was choking him on live television. The entire country, holding its breath, listened to the chief architect of German aerial supremacy publicly choking on his own powerlessness, while wooden enemy aircraft circled unpunished above his head. This radio broadcast became the most terrible slap in the face for the Nazi leadership during all the years of the conflict, turning their boasted promises into an object of vicious mockery. When the 16 German fighters sent in pursuit finally fell behind, failing to approach the Mosquitoes even to a distance of visual contact, the propaganda damage reached a critical point. The British press the next morning would come out with mocking headlines, and fresh photographs of the panicking Berlin would fly across all world news agencies, proving the vulnerability of the Reich. Not a single one of the newest Messerschmitts or Focke-Wulfs was able to protect the honor of its commander, demonstrating to the whole world the absolute structural failure of the German defense doctrine. The Plywood reconnaissance planes returned to their bases in England without a single scratch, leaving behind not destroyed factories, but the completely obliterated reputation of the once invincible aerial armada. This audacious morning raid forever drove an aspen stake into the ambitions of the Luftwaffe, proving that absolute speed can not only win battles but also break entire ideological systems. The carefully constructed image of an impregnable fortress collapsed overnight, leaving behind only the acrid smell of burnt anti-aircraft gunpowder and a bitter feeling of national humiliation. The senior officers of the Reich understood perfectly well that this incident could not be hidden or written off as an accidental oversight by individual dispatch services. Millions of radio listeners from Hamburg to Munich became involuntary witnesses to how empty promises crumbled to dust, accompanied by the sirens of an air raid alert. No subsequent excuses from the mouth of the propaganda ministry could erase from memory this resounding flick on the nose, delivered by just 3 unarmed machines made of glued wood. The catastrophe on that frosty day was not measured by the number of downed planes or burned tanks. It was measured by the depth of the shock that paralyzed the entire chain of command. On the 4th of February 1943, an infuriated Hermann Göring, whose reputation hung literally by a thread after the Berlin disgrace, issued an absolutely hysterical order. Desiring to exact revenge on the British at any cost, he demanded the formation of 2 specialized elite fighter units whose sole purpose would be the interception of the elusive Plywood machines. Jagdgeschwader 25 was placed under the command of Oberstleutnant Herbert Ihlefeld, a celebrated veteran with 132 victories. Jagdgeschwader 50 was headed by Hauptmann Hermann Graf, a legendary Knight's Cross holder with oak leaves and swords, who had an incredible 212 downed opponents on his personal record. Both commanders were given absolute carte blanche, the best newest equipment, priority supply, and complete freedom in inventing new tactical schemes. The elite squadrons received heavily modified Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6s, equipped with experimental methanol water injection systems codenamed MW50. This risky chemical injection allowed the engine power to be briefly boosted to an insane 1,800 horsepower, providing a speed increase of about 20 miles per hour at maximum altitudes. The daily training program was radically rewritten. Now the aces were taught not to engage in maneuverable combat, but to take positions far ahead of the enemy's expected route, gaining massive altitude in advance. The idea was to save scarce fuel for one single, crushing dive from above. This relates to those desperate attempts to turn the tide of history by brute force when the original strategy has hit a blind, hopeless dead end. The first real baptism of fire for the elite unit took place on the 19th of February 1943, when ground radars detected a single British bomber. At exactly 0 hours 47 minutes, the target was recorded approaching Berlin, and Ihlefeld immediately launched a flight of 8 interceptors. The German machines formed a wall at an altitude of 28,000 feet right along the enemy's calculated vector of movement, turning into an ambush. The wooden plane appeared down to the second exactly where the Luftwaffe analysts predicted, unaware of the prepared trap. Ihlefeld personally led the swift attack, throwing his modernized fighter and 3 wingmen into a steep, howling dive from above. Thanks to gravity and methanol injection, his speed exceeded 450 miles per hour, allowing him to close the distance to the target to 800 meters at the lowest point of the trajectory. But as soon as the dive ended and the German ace had to level the plane into horizontal flight, the colossal speed advantage evaporated without a trace within a mere 60 seconds. The enemy Plywood, without even changing course, simply dissolved into the haze, leaving the heavily panting Messerschmitt engines running in vain. The ensuing dry combat report documented a complete, unconditional fiasco. The British aircraft in horizontal flight at an altitude of 26,000 feet consistently delivered 410 miles per hour. The maximum speed of the accelerated German interceptor in the same conditions did not exceed 390 miles per hour, creating an insurmountable deficit of 20 miles. The window of opportunity for aimed fire was a ludicrous 4 seconds at the extreme, almost kilometer-long distance. The probability of successfully hitting a rapidly receding target under such variables mathematically equaled absolute zero. This relates to situations where specialized tools prove completely useless if the fundamental doctrine itself was built on false premises. Over the course of long, exhausting months, the units repeated these hopeless attempts time after time, losing their composure and burning tons of fuel. By November 1943, Achlefeld's praised group claimed only 2 pitiful victories, and even those were over machines experiencing severe mechanical engine trouble. During the same period, the squadron irretrievably lost 9 of its interceptors. They were shot down by British escort fighters, while the Germans sweat profusely chasing wooden ghosts. In that same November, these elite but absolutely useless special units were quietly and shamefully disbanded. The resounding failure forced German engineers to face the truth, and certified engineer Kurt Tank, the chief designer of the Focke-Wulf factories, formulated the problem with frightening, brutal clarity. As early as March 1943, he wrote in a memorandum that German fighters were created exclusively to destroy tight formations of heavy bombers. Reich engineers deliberately relied on thick armor, large caliber cannons, and phenomenal maneuverability, sacrificing absolute speed. The British project, however, proved that a machine built solely for speed generates tactical capabilities against which the Reich simply has no arguments. Developing a fundamentally new high-altitude interceptor required many years, which a Germany suffocating under bombs no longer had. Kurt Tank's own highly ambitious answer was the TA-152H project, a pressurized, high-altitude monster based on the Focke-Wulf 190D fighter. This impressive machine received incredibly long wings and a modernized Junkers Jumo 213E engine with 2,500 horsepower. On blueprints, this masterpiece of Teutonic thought promised to accelerate to 472 miles per hour at a fantastic altitude of 41,000 feet, which was supposed to guarantee supremacy. This relates to tragic historical paradoxes when the perfect technological solution is born too late to somehow influence the catastrophic outcome. The first production models of this formidable machine reached combat units only in January 1945, 2 agonizing years after the Reichsmarschall's hysterical order. Total production barely reached 150 units, and those rare pilots who managed to encounter the Mosquito in the sky were never able to record a single victory. All the hopes of the Nazi elite now rested on jet aviation. The turbojet Messerschmitt Me 262, which was supposed to turn the British piece of wood into dust. Delivering a staggering 540 miles per hour, the jet aircraft could indeed catch any aerial target in the world, but its technical imperfection minimized all advantages. Catastrophic kerosene consumption limited flight time to a miserable 45 minutes, and the capricious engines required complete replacement every 25 hours. On the 14th of February 1945, Lieutenant Fritz Müller of the 7th Fighter Wing attempted to intercept a Briton over Bremen. Spotting the wooden bomber at an altitude of 28,000 feet, the German pilot directed his jet machine into an attack, accelerating to a crazy 500 miles per hour. But then the ruthless laws of physics came into play. The British crew noticed the approaching threat in time and simply initiated a smooth, prolonged turn at a constant speed. At a speed of 500 miles per hour, the turning radius of the German jet Marvel turned out to be so enormous that maneuvering turned into a complete, uncontrollable disaster. Müller flew past his target at massive speed, instantly lost sight of the wooden plane, and was forced to return to the airfield in disgrace. The innovative turbojet thrust, into which the Reich invested its last billions, proved absolutely powerless against the perfect balance of speed and maneuverability of ordinary British plywood. A loud bout of hysteria in the highest echelons of power of the Third Reich, documented by dispassionate stenographers. On the 18th of March 1943, the luxurious Karen Hall residence shook from the furious shouts of the commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe. Speaking before the turning pale leaders of the German aviation industry, Hermann Göring uttered words that will forever remain a symbol of the deepest national humiliation. He frantically screamed that he turns green and yellow with intense envy every time he sees this elusive British aircraft in the sky. How is it even possible, the enraged Reichsmarshal demanded to know, that a nation possessing vast reserves of high-quality aluminum hands over the production of its newest bombers into the hands of simple piano tuners and kitchen furniture makers? Why are British geniuses hammering together a masterpiece from ordinary boards, capable of effortlessly outrunning the elite of German fighter aviation, while the praised designers of the Reich turn out to be complete non-entities? This frank admission of his own powerlessness instantly spread through all closed aviation circles of Germany, causing the effect of an exploding bombshell. Pilots and engineers, despite the strictest censorship, began to whisper about what was already obvious to everyone. British pragmatism had dealt a crushing blow to clumsy German technical pride. The secret of the phenomenal success of the machine lay not in the presence of some mythical secret weapon or unprecedented advanced technologies, but in an incredibly cynical and calculating approach to the very concept of military production. The British Crown did not deplete its strategic reserves of scarce metals, but simply transferred the assembly of deadly machines to ordinary civilian shipyards, sawmills, and carpentry workshops scattered across the island. This relates to those brilliant logistical solutions when the weakness of an economy suddenly turns into its most formidable and indestructible advantage. The production of almost 8,000 plywood bombers during the conflict did not reduce the output of legendary metal Spitfire fighters or heavy four-engine Lancaster Giants by a single ounce. While the factories of the Reich were suffocating from a catastrophic shortage of strategic raw materials and qualified personnel, English carpenters and joiners quietly glued smooth fuselages from laminated birch, Ecuadorian balsa, and Canadian spruce. Glued wood proved to be a true structural miracle, which perfectly absorbed bullet impacts and did not deform the way fragile duralumin did. An incredible case is known when one of the reconnaissance planes of the 105th Squadron returned to base with more than 200 heavy machine gun bullet holes in its wooden hull, yet the machine remained absolutely intact, and the entire crew left the cockpit without a single scratch. Repairing such aircraft right in field conditions required minimal training. A punctured piece of the fuselage could be fixed with a can of glue, a piece of plywood, and ordinary carpentry tools. All this incredible industrial efficiency dealt a much more terrible blow to the economy of the Third Reich than direct hits from heavy, high-explosive bombs. The German anti-aircraft defense was forced to spend colossal, astronomical resources attempting to stop these audacious, elusive targets. Every heavy anti-aircraft battery panically firing thousands of scarce shells into the night sky at the flashing wooden shadows, vainly burned ammunition whose cost was calculated in millions of Reichsmarks. Every huge radar station, distracted by tracking swift solitary raids, lost sight of the main formations of heavy Allied aviation, leaving German cities completely defenseless. This relates to those hidden mechanisms of total war, where the victor is not the one whose cannon shoots louder, but the one whose industry is capable of working stably and without failures under colossal pressure. Every elite German fighter that dispatchers panically scrambled for a hopeless interception of yet another elusive wooden target instantly became unavailable to protect crucial industrial facilities from real massive strikes. The British Plywood literally drove the entire praised air defense system of Germany crazy, sowing chaos, panic, and absolute disorganization in the ranks of the defenders. The famous Generalleutnant Adolf Galland, an undeniable authority with 104 victories on his personal account, sent Göring an absolutely devastating analytical assessment in May 1944. The general, with murderous professional coldness, stated that the wooden bomber represents the highest point of British design philosophy, where the machine was brilliantly optimized to perform a single task. Galland openly admitted that German designers had suffered a fundamental, shameful failure by trying to force their heavy, armor-clad aircraft to perform a multitude of incompatible roles at once. As a result, the praised German aviation had not a single machine capable of replicating the enemy's success, and, most terrifyingly, there was not a single tool to stop this success. The situation worsened to the extreme when new modifications of the British machines began to take on board bombs weighing 4,000 pounds, dropping them on the heads of the Germans with mocking precision. Armed with 42mm cannons, the assault variants began to destroy vital railway stations with impunity, approaching at such extremely low altitudes that the praised German radars simply did not have time to notice them. German pilots could only watch as their mighty, technologically advanced empire collapsed under the strikes of aircraft assembled by the hands of simple furniture makers. The definitive, ruthless statistics of war put everything in its place, turning pompous reports and excuses into dry dust. During the years of the Second World War, the British Aircraft Manufacturing Company assembled nearly 7,800 Mosquitoes in various modifications, which became a real nightmare for the defense of the Third Reich. If you look at the dry figures of combat losses, then out of this huge number of machines, about 1,200 aircraft disappeared forever in the skies over Europe. But the most deafening blow to the reputation of German fighter aviation is the fact that less than 100 of them were officially confirmed victims of German fighters. The vast majority of these machines were lost due to fatal mechanical malfunctions, navigation errors in night raids, or massive anti-aircraft artillery fire. The efficiency ratio of the elite Luftwaffe units, which were created specifically to fight this wooden phantom, did not even reach 1.5%. This relates to those final performance indicators that turn years of effort by an entire military machine into a bitter mockery of common sense. Oberleutnant Wilhelm Jornen, the very pilot who in September 42 was the first to desperately try to catch George Perry's plane over Berlin, managed to survive the horrors of the war. In his memoirs, published in 1956, he left an honest and very painful testimony about that first encounter, which determined the fate of his entire squadron. He wrote directly that from that very September morning he realized German pilots had encountered a phenomenon that was impossible to counter with available means. The Britain's speed was not just high, it was absolute, fundamental, and unreachable for any machine in the Reich's service. Jordan recalled with bitterness that the chase for the Mosquito was like hunting a ghost. You see the target, you burn your engine in attempts to close the distance, but every time it inevitably slips away into the void. This relates to those philosophical insights that come to professionals only when the line between victory and defeat becomes tangible. The frustration felt by the best German aces was absolute, for no skill or accumulated experience could compensate for the physical lag in performance. This entire experience became a symbol of the complete, deafening collapse of German defense strategy, which bet on maneuver rather than pure dynamics. The wooden miracle, born in simple carpentry workshops, won the victory over the complex engineering pyramid of Nazi Germany, not due to superiority in cannon caliber or armor thickness. It won this war due to the triumph of British pragmatism, which managed to isolate what was most important, the requirements of a specific combat mission, and build a tool ideally sharpened for this request. The wooden bomber, which German intelligence, due to its short-sightedness, rejected as evidence of poverty and technological weakness of Britain, turned into a symbol of true ingenuity. The aircraft that demonstratively flew over Berlin in the very minutes when Reichsmarschall Göring was broadcasting about his dominance live on air, forever went down in history as the propaganda killer. It did not just survive the years of war, it became a dominant factor that turned German fighter pilots into disappointed, exhausted spectators, powerlessly watching their opponent easily disappear into the distance. The pilot's joke about see, chase, lose turned out not to be an expression of military humor, but the most accurate and concise admission of defeat. Ultimately, the fastest and swiftest lesson of the war turned out to be the most difficult for the German command to learn. The best pilots in Europe, the most advanced jet developments, and thousands of anti-aircraft crews were never able to catch the Plywood bomber because Britain built something fundamentally more effective. The Mosquito proved to the entire planet that in the physics of war, speed is not just a characteristic. It is the only reliable protection you really need. Once you become fast enough, everything else, heavy armor, cumbersome turrets, thousands of shells, becomes superfluous and unnecessary weight. And this simple truth, captured in a smooth wooden fuselage, became the final chord, putting an end to the multi-year dispute between German perfectionism and British speed. The story of the Mosquito is not just a tale about an aircraft. It is a lesson in how a single brilliant idea, backed by bold calculation, can bring an entire system to its knees, no matter how powerful it may seem. What do you think about this wooden miracle? If you were in the shoes of the German engineers of that time, would you have admitted defeat, or would you have tried to catch the ghost until the very end? Share your thoughts in the comments. We are very interested to hear your take on this confrontation. If you enjoyed this episode from our archive of inconvenient facts, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories about how a single detail changed the course of entire eras. And don't forget to ring the bell. This way, you'll be the first to know when the next video drops. See you in the next episodes.